On Christmas Eve, the Frost family gathered in their cozy home, ready to enjoy the holiday together. But when an unmarked gift mysteriously appears under the tree, something feels off. Wrapped in old paper with strange symbols, its presence sends a chill through the room. The family is left questioning its origins, and before they can decide whether to open it, a cryptic phone call warns them not to. As they ignore the warning and unwrap the gift, they discover a sinister doll that seems to come alive, bringing with it an ancient curse. Can they survive the horrors that await, or have they sealed their fate forever? The Frost family huddled together, their faces glowing in the warmth of the fire that crackled in the hearth. Outside, the snow fell in thick, fluffy layers, painting the world white and silent. The house smelled like pine and cinnamon, and the soft hum of Christmas music filled the room. Everything felt perfect. Celine Frost smiled as she watched her children, Aurelia and Kai, laughing and tearing into their gifts. Callum, her husband, sat beside her, his arm around her shoulder as they exchanged glances of quiet joy. Granville, Callum's father, was dozing on the couch, while Celine's siblings, Zara and Dorian, chatted animatedly by the window. It was a typical Christmas Eve, or at least, it was supposed to be. But then something strange happened. A shadow flickered across the tree, catching the eye of everyone in the room. Beneath the twinkling lights, something new had appeared. It wasn't there moments ago, but now, right in the center, there was an unmarked gift. It sat there like it had always been, wrapped in old, crinkled paper. The paper was covered in strange, jagged symbols that looked almost like a foreign language, or a language lost to time. No one could remember bringing it in. No one had seen anyone place it there. Everyone's gaze shifted to it, confusion creeping into their minds. Had they forgotten? Or was this something different? Aurelia was the first to speak. "Who put that there?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, as if the question itself felt wrong. Callum frowned, glancing at Celine, but neither of them could explain it. No one could. The room suddenly felt colder, the air thick and heavy, as if the house itself had taken a breath and held it. Celine, trying to shake off the creeping unease, laughed nervously. "It's probably just a joke," she said, but her voice lacked its usual warmth. The smile she forced didn't reach her eyes. The chill in the air hadn't gone away. If anything, it felt like it had settled deeper into the bones of the house. Even Cleo, the family dog, had stopped wagging her tail, her ears flat against her head, staring at the gift as though it was something more than just a wrapped box. Granville shifted in his chair, his old eyes squinting at the gift with suspicion. "That's strange," he muttered, almost to himself. Who would have left something like that here? The room fell silent. The music played on, but it felt distant, like the sound was coming from far away. Callum stood up slowly, his footsteps heavy as he moved toward the gift. The others watched, but no one said anything. The closer he got, the colder the room seemed to grow, like the walls were closing in, like the very air was pushing against him. His hand hovered over the package, and for a moment, he hesitated. There was something in the pit of his stomach that told him not to touch it, not to open it. But then, with a nervous laugh, he picked it up, and everything around him seemed to change. The lights flickered, dimming for just a moment, and then the temperature in the room dropped even further. Celine felt it first, a shiver running down her spine. But when Callum held the gift in his hands, the chill spread throughout the entire house. The fire seemed to burn colder, the warmth fading away like it was being sucked into the darkness. It was subtle at first, like the heat had been turned down just a little too low, but soon it was undeniable. "What is that?" Kai asked, his voice trembling, his small hands clutching onto Aurelia's sleeve. Even the children, usually so filled with energy and joy, were unnerved by the eerie atmosphere now thickening in the room. "I don't know," Callum said, his voice tight. "But we're about to find out." He carefully peeled the paper back, the rustling sound too loud in the quiet room. The moment the wrapping came off, a sense of wrongness settled over them all. There, inside the paper, was a doll. It was old, too old. The doll's porcelain face was cracked, its eyes dark and hollow, as if they had seen things no one should ever see. The dress it wore was tattered, the lace frayed and yellowed with age. The doll's hands were small and delicate, but its fingers looked too stiff, almost as though they weren't meant to move. Celine's heart skipped a beat. "What is this?" she whispered, but no one answered. No one knew. And just as the last of the wrapping paper was removed, the temperature in the room plunged. The fire in the hearth flickered violently, and a sudden gust of cold wind slammed into the walls, rattling the windows. The room was filled with a bone-chilling cold that cut right through the warmth of the house, making everyone shiver. For a moment, no one spoke. The doll sat there in Callum's hands, its empty eyes staring up at them. The atmosphere had shifted entirely. Gone was the joy and merriment of the Christmas Eve they'd expected. It was replaced with a suffocating silence, thick with the sense that something was horribly wrong. No one knew where it had come from, or why it had arrived at that exact moment, but it didn't feel like an innocent gift. It felt like a warning. Aurelia's voice broke the silence, her words barely audible. "Should we open it?" Her eyes darted nervously between the doll and her family. No one knew what to say. Something was telling them not to. Something deep inside warned them that whatever was tied to this doll, whatever dark force it carried, would change everything. Granville cleared his throat, his voice shaky. "I don't think we should." He had lived a long life, seen things he never spoke about, and the look in his eyes now told them he knew this was something beyond their understanding. Celine tried to shake off the growing fear gnawing at her insides. "It's just a doll, Granville. It's harmless," she said, but even as the words left her mouth, she didn't believe them. There was something about the doll, about the way it sat there, lifeless and still, that didn't sit right. As Callum stared down at it, his grip tightening on the doll, he suddenly felt it. An eerie sense that he was not alone, that something was watching him, waiting. The silence in the room felt alive, like the very air was holding its breath, waiting for the next move. "Maybe we should just leave it," Zara murmured from across the room, her voice small and filled with unease. "It doesn't feel right." But before anyone could respond, a soft noise, like a whisper, echoed through the room. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A voice, a soft voice. It was calling someone's name, though no one could say whose. The chill in the air intensified, and the sound of the wind outside seemed to grow louder, as though the house itself was shivering. Something was wrong, very wrong, and for the first time that night, no one dared to move. The Frost family stood frozen, their hearts racing in the growing darkness. The only thing that was clear was that the decision they were about to make, whether to open the doll or leave it, would set in motion a series of events they could never undo. Whatever this gift was, it was no ordinary present, and whatever had arrived with it, they would never be able to escape. As the family stood there, frozen in place, staring at the doll in Callan's hands, the silence was broken by the shrill ring of the phone. It was sharp, cutting through the tense stillness, making everyone jump. Celine flinched, her breath caught in her throat. For a moment, no one moved, unsure whether to answer it. The phone rang again, louder this time, more insistent. Celine's fingers shook as she reached for the receiver, almost as if the air itself was warning her not to pick it up. "Hello," she answered, her voice steadier than she felt. There was a long pause on the other end, a deep, unsettling silence that stretched far too long. Then the voice came through, but it wasn't clear. It was distorted, crackling like a bad connection, but it was unmistakably frantic. The words that followed were jagged, urgent, and filled with an undeniable panic. "Don't open it." The voice rasped, barely audible over the static. "It's already too late. You've made a terrible mistake." Celine's heart skipped a beat. Her grip tightened on the phone, her breath shallow. The voice was trembling, as if the person on the other end was being torn apart by something unseen. Before she could ask who it was or demand more information, the voice repeated, "It's already too late. Don't open it." The line went silent for a moment, the static growing louder, crackling like thunder in the background. Celine's mind raced. Was this some kind of prank? A twisted joke from one of their friends, or maybe a family member? She glanced at Callum, who stood beside her, just as bewildered as she was. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could say anything, the voice on the other end came again, this time even more strained. "It's too late. They've already seen you," the voice whispered. "They're watching." The words hit like a blow, sending a chill creeping up Celine's spine. She could feel her hands grow cold, the foam growing heavier in her grip as if it was becoming a weight she couldn't escape. She tried to speak again, to demand answers, but the connection cut off abruptly, the line going dead with a harsh click. Silence fell once more, heavy and oppressive. The phone slipped from Celine's hand, landing with a dull thud on the floor. She didn't move to pick it up. She just stood there, her heart pounding in her chest, the words echoing in her mind. "They're watching." Callum, unable to shake his own unease, stepped forward and scooped up the phone, staring at it as if it might give him some answer. That wasn't a prank, Celine. That didn't sound like a joke. Zara, who had been standing in the corner, arms crossed tightly over her chest, finally spoke up, her voice low and shaken. "It didn't sound like a joke to me either." She looked at her brother, Dorian, who met her gaze, both of them sharing a silent understanding. There was something in the warning that didn't feel fake. Something about it felt real, like they were being pulled into something they couldn't control. Granville, who had been quiet up until now, his ancient eyes narrowed in thought, finally spoke. "I've seen enough in my time to know when a warning's worth listening to." He looked at Callum, then to Celine, his voice serious. "We need to be careful. This isn't something you should ignore." Celine shook her head, still unwilling to accept the gravity of the situation. "It's just a phone call. It's probably someone messing with us." But even as she said the words, she didn't believe them. The air felt thick, heavy, as though something dark was creeping closer to them. The doll, still in Callum's hands, seemed to stare at them, its hollow eyes unblinking, unseeing, but somehow knowing. A sense of dread began to sink into the pit of Celine's stomach, and her mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation. But there was none. Nothing made sense. "We can't just pretend like nothing's happened," Dorian said, his voice tight with concern. "We need to figure out what's going on before it's too late." The tension in the room grew. Everyone stood frozen, unsure of what to do next. Should they ignore the warning and open the gift anyway? Or should they take the advice of the mysterious caller and leave it untouched? The decision loomed over them like a storm cloud, and with every passing second, it felt heavier. The sound of the wind outside picked up, howling through the trees, its eerie wail seeping through the cracks of the house. A cold draft swept across the room, making the fire flicker weakly, as though it too was losing its fight against the encroaching darkness. The unease in the air thickened, and the family stood in the center of it, caught between curiosity. Kai's small voice cut through the tension. "Why don't we just open it?" His innocent question hung in the air, and for a moment, everyone was still. The room seemed to hold its breath, the silence deafening. Everyone knew the answer to his question, but no one dared speak it aloud. "Because something isn't right," Celine finally said, her voice barely more than a whisper. The words felt like an admission of defeat, but they were the only words that made sense. And yet, even as she spoke them, a part of her wanted to open the gift. A part of her wanted to know what lay inside, to satisfy the growing curiosity that gnawed at her. What could be so dangerous about a simple gift? But the other part of her, the part that had listened to the call and felt the cold touch of fear creep over her skin, knew better. She glanced once more at the doll, its glassy eyes following her every move. "We can't open it," Granville said, his voice firm. "Not yet. Not until we know more." But as the family stood there, caught in the thickening web of fear and uncertainty, one question lingered in the air, unanswered. What was really inside that gift, and what had they already set in motion by bringing it into their home? The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the silence, each passing second making the decision more urgent, more impossible to ignore. As the family waited, the night stretched on, the darkness outside pressing closer and closer, as though it were waiting for them to make their move. The phone call, the warning, the doll, all of it seemed to hang over them like a dark cloud, its presence impossible to escape. And with every passing moment, the weight of the choice ahead grew heavier, more suffocating. They couldn't ignore it any longer. Something had to be done. But what? And at what cost? The family stood gathered around the Christmas tree, staring at the mysterious gift that had arrived with no explanation. After a long pause, Celine made the decision. "We're opening it," she said, her voice steady despite the unease that wrapped around her like a cold blanket. Slowly, she reached down, her fingers brushing against the crinkled paper. Callum stood close beside her, his jaw clenched, eyes never leaving the gift. The tension in the room was thick, almost unbearable. With a swift tear, the paper gave way, revealing a large wooden box. It was old, its surface scratched and worn, as if it had been through many years of neglect. The family exchanged uncertain glances, but no one spoke. Something about it felt wrong, yet the curiosity that burned in their chests urged them on. Celine lifted the lid slowly, her heart racing in anticipation. Inside the box, sitting on a bed of faded velvet, was a doll. But not just any doll. This one was unlike anything the family had ever seen before. Its porcelain face was cracked, the once beautiful features now marred by deep fissures running down its cheeks. Its eyes were hollow, dark voids that seemed to suck in the light around them. It was dressed in a tattered, old-fashioned gown, the fabric yellowed with age. The doll was unnervingly lifelike, its limbs positioned in an unsettling pose, as if it were about to move. Aurelia, unable to resist the strange allure of the doll, reached forward first. She picked it up with both hands, the porcelain cold and rough against her fingers. As soon as she touched it, the temperature in the room dropped, a sudden and unnatural chill spreading through the air. Everyone felt it. The heat of the fireplace seemed to vanish, replaced by an oppressive cold that made their breath visible in the dim light. Kai, standing close by, his wide eyes locked on the doll, reached out with a shaky hand. He smiled in a way that sent a shiver down Celine's spine. It wasn't the innocent, joyful smile of a child who had just seen a new toy. No, this smile was strange, too wide, too unnatural. It made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. He slowly reached out, almost in a trance, as if drawn by an invisible force. "It's pretty," he whispered, his voice too soft. Cleo, the family dog, who had been resting by the fire, suddenly stood up with a low growl. Her hackles were raised, and her eyes were fixed on the doll, her growl deepening into a vicious bark. The sound was sharp and unsettling, making everyone jump. The dog barked again, this time more forcefully, as if trying to warn them. Cleo backed away slowly, her eyes never leaving the doll. Her teeth bared in a way that was completely out of character for her. The atmosphere in the room grew heavy, and a sense of dread began to settle over them all. Aurelia, still holding the doll, felt the weight of its eyes on her. The cracks in its porcelain face seemed to deepen, as though the doll were watching her every move. She quickly set it down on the table, as if trying to shake off the strange, uncomfortable feeling it gave her. But even as it rested there, the doll seemed to draw all the attention in the room. No one could look away. The air felt thick, charged with an energy that none of them could explain. The room creaked, the old wood groaning under some unseen weight. A strange sound echoed from the walls, like whispering, too faint to catch, but enough to make every spine in the room shiver. The lights flickered, dimming for a moment before returning to their normal brightness. But the strange feeling remained. It was as if the house itself had suddenly become aware of something, watching them with unseen eyes. Granville, who had been silently observing, took a step forward, his eyes narrowing. "There's something wrong with this doll," he muttered under his breath, though he didn't dare go near it. "It's not just a toy." Zara, who had been quiet until now, stepped forward cautiously. "What if we just throw it away? Burn it, maybe," she suggested, her voice trembling slightly. "This feels wrong. It's like it's alive." But Celine, always the skeptic, shook her head. "It's just a doll," she said firmly, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. She tried to dismiss the unease creeping into her own thoughts, but she couldn't ignore the way the doll seemed to be watching her. "There's nothing to worry about." But then the dog barked again, louder this time, and the air seemed to thicken with tension. The house groaned again, and the lights flickered once more. It was as though the doll's presence was distorting reality itself, warping the familiar warmth of their home into something sinister. The family looked at one another, their faces pale, their bodies frozen in place, unable to tear their eyes away from the doll. Each of them felt it, the oppressive weight that pressed in on them, making their skin crawl. The doll's eyes, hollow and dark, seemed to flicker with something more than just lifelessness. The room felt colder, and the silence felt heavier than it ever had before. The moments stretched on, and the atmosphere thickened with dread. No one dared to speak, the tension palpable. It was as if the room itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. But what? And as the minutes ticked by, the family couldn't shake the growing sense that they had made a terrible mistake by opening the gift. The doll, now resting on the table, was no longer just a doll. It was something more, something dangerous, something that had come into their home for a reason. And that reason was not one they could understand. They had opened the gift, and now whatever had been unleashed was watching. The family was on edge, the unsettling presence of the doll hanging over them like a storm cloud that refused to break. Celine and Callum had spent hours pacing the living room, both of them unable to shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The doll's hollow eyes seemed to follow their every movement, its silent gaze like a curse in itself. The cold in the room had grown unbearable, and every creak of the floorboards echoed like an omen. Celine couldn't take it anymore. She had to know where this doll had come from. "Callum, we need answers," Celine said, her voice strained but determined. Callum hesitated, glancing over at the doll that now sat in a corner of the room, its face cracked and eerie. The air in the house felt thick, suffocating, as though the walls themselves were closing in on them. "I know," Callum replied quietly, "but what if we're opening a door we shouldn't?" "We already opened it," Celine said. "Now we need to figure out what's on the other side." The two of them set out to investigate, pulling old boxes from the attic and rummaging through family records. The house seemed to watch them as they searched, the very air holding its breath. At first, there were no leads. Everything seemed normal, until Callum found something buried deep in an old trunk. It was a faded newspaper clipping, the edges yellowed and brittle. The headline read, "Missing Child on Christmas Eve." The article was short, but chilling. It told the story of a young girl, Evelyn Pierce, who had gone missing on Christmas Eve many years ago. The circumstances were strange. No one knew where she had disappeared to, and no clues were ever found. Her family, devastated by the loss, had moved away shortly afterward, leaving the house abandoned. But there was something else mentioned in the article that made Celine's blood run cold. Evelyn's favorite possession, the one thing she never let go of, was a doll just like the one sitting in their living room. "This can't be a coincidence," Callum said, his voice low, as if afraid the walls might hear him. "It's the same doll." Celine felt a cold shiver run down her spine. But the story didn't end there. As they continued digging, they found more references to Evelyn Pierce and her doll. A few records mentioned rumors that the doll was cursed, that it brought misfortune to anyone who owned it. The stories were fragmented, scattered across different towns, but the theme was the same. Every family that had come into possession of the doll had suffered terrible consequences: fires, illnesses, strange deaths. The more they uncovered, the more the pieces began to fall into place. The doll wasn't just a creepy toy. It was something much darker. It was tied to a malevolent force that haunted the house, something that had existed long before they had moved in. Every family that had owned it had been dragged into the same nightmare, and it seemed like the Frost family was no different. The very presence of the doll in their home had already set the curse into motion. Granville, who had been listening from the other room, stepped into the study, his face grim. "You need to stop looking," he said softly, almost pleading. "There are some things you don't want to know." But it was too late. Celine and Callum exchanged a look, a mix of fear and determination. They had already opened the gift. They had already brought the curse into their lives. There was no turning back now. The deeper they went, the more they learned. The doll's origins were shrouded in darkness, tied to ancient rituals and unspoken secrets. No one knew exactly what had caused the curse to take hold, but it was clear that the doll was a vessel for something far more powerful than any of them could have imagined. Something that had been waiting for the right moment to strike. As the night dragged on, Celine's mind raced. They had invited something into their home, something far worse than they had realized. The doll was no mere object. It was a doorway, a conduit for the darkness that had followed it. And now that the door had been opened, there was no telling what horrors they had unleashed. Callum's voice cut through the silence. "What do we do now? How do we stop it?" Celine didn't have an answer. The weight of the knowledge they had uncovered was suffocating, and the room felt colder with every passing moment. The air was thick with something unexplainable, something malevolent. The family had been warned, but they hadn't listened. Now, they were trapped in the web of a curse they couldn't escape. The doll had already begun its work. The suspense in the house was unbearable, the ticking of the clock almost deafening. They had thought they could ignore the warnings, dismiss the strange events as coincidence. But now, as the minutes dragged on, it became clear the curse was real, and there was no way to undo the damage they had done. With the curse already in motion, they were all bound to it now. The doll had claimed its place in their home, and it would not leave until it had taken everything it wanted. The house had never felt so cold. As the night grew darker, an unsettling stillness blanketed the Frost family home. Everything seemed to hold its breath. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, but inside, it was deathly quiet. Celine paced nervously, her thoughts racing, trying to make sense of everything they had uncovered. Callum was at the door, peering out into the darkness. But the cold that had crept into the house wasn't from the winter chill. It was something far worse. In the living room, Aurelia sat alone, her back stiff as she stared at the doll. She had been trying to focus on her phone, attempting to ignore the growing sense of dread that filled the house. But something wasn't right. The doll, which had been sitting innocently in the corner, now appeared different. It was upright. Its cracked porcelain face seemed to gleam in the dim light, its hollow eyes fixed on her. Aurelia's heart skipped a beat. She shook her head, convincing herself that it was just her imagination playing tricks on her. But then, the curtains fluttered, a gust of cold wind sweeping through the room despite the windows being shut tight. The sudden chill made her skin crawl, and she felt a sharp, icy pressure settle in the pit of. She turned her attention back to the doll. Its head, it moved. Slowly, it turned, almost imperceptibly, until it was facing her. Aurelia froze, her breath caught in her throat, her body tense as she stared at the doll. The room felt wrong, alive in a way that made her skin prickle with fear. Without thinking, Aurelia stood up, her heart pounding in her chest. She rushed to the door, her hand gripping the handle. It wouldn't budge. Panic set in as she pulled harder, yanking with all her strength. but the door was sealed shut. She backed away, eyes wide, the room spinning with terror, the doll's head tilted slightly to the side, as if it were studying her. Then, a soft whisper echoed through the room. "Aurelia." The voice was faint, barely a breath, but unmistakable. It sent a wave of ice through her veins, and she stumbled backward, colliding with the wall. The doll had spoken. It wasn't just sitting there anymore. It was alive. "Aurelia." The whisper came again, this time clearer, more insistent. It felt like the room itself was closing in on her, the walls pressing together, suffocating her. The doll's lips moved ever so slightly, the faintest twitch, and she could feel its gaze boring into her soul. Her legs trembled beneath her, but she tried to scream, to call out for help. Nothing came. Her voice was swallowed by an oppressive silence, an eerie void that filled the entire house. The air seemed to thicken around her, like the very space was being twisted and contorted by the malevolent force that now controlled it. Suddenly, she heard the sound of footsteps. Callum, Celine, and the others were coming. But as they approached, Aurelia couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. She turned toward the door, desperate to escape, but the shadow of the doll grew larger, filling the room with an overwhelming presence. She heard her name again, whispered in a voice that was both familiar and foreign. "Aurelia." She felt as if the walls were closing in, her chest tight, her breath shallow. She wanted to move, to run, but the doll's eyes, those hollow, dark eyes, held her captive. It was as if it was controlling her, forcing her to remain in the room, to stay locked in its gaze. Then the door burst open. Callum and Celine rushed in, their faces pale with fear. "Aurelia," Callum shouted, but his voice seemed to echo from a distance, muffled by the same heavy silence that surrounded her. They saw her standing there, frozen in place, staring at the doll that now sat perfectly still, as if nothing had happened. The family rushed to her side, trying to shake her from her stupor, but as they did, the doll shifted. Its head turned again, slowly, until it faced them, its cracked mouth curling into an unsettling, twisted smile. It was as if it knew they were there, aware of them in a way that no doll should be. "Mom." "Dad?" Aurelia whispered, her voice trembling. "It's moving. It spoke to me." Callum, his voice low and shaky, turned to Celine. "It's not just a doll. It's something else." The family stood in the room, too scared to move, too terrified to speak. The doll's smile widened, its hollow eyes gleaming with something dark, something hungry. They all felt it. The air in the house had changed. It wasn't just cold anymore. It was suffocating, thick with a presence that pressed down on them. Granville, who had been standing in the doorway, looked at them with wide, fearful eyes. He had seen this before. The terror, the curse, it was all real. And it was already too late. As the room grew colder still, they began to realize that the doll wasn't just watching them. It was feeding on their fear. Every movement, every breath they took, seemed to make it stronger. It was no longer a toy. It was a vessel. And it was alive. The suspense tightened its grip on them. Every second felt like an eternity as the doll seemed to come closer, its twisted grin widening, its eyes flashing with malice. It was no longer just a toy left under the tree. It was a nightmare made flesh. The tension in the house was unbearable. The walls seemed to close in on them, growing smaller with each passing second. As the clock ticked away, the family members barely spoke, their minds too consumed by the overwhelming dread that clung to the air. The doll sat in the corner, its hollow eyes constantly watching, always waiting. No one could shake the feeling that it was alive, its sinister presence growing stronger by the minute. Granville, the usually strong and grounded patriarch, was no longer the man they knew. His mind had begun to unravel. He wandered the house, muttering incoherently about things from his past, things he had buried long ago. "It's here. It's always been here," he whispered, his voice trembling. His hand shook as he clutched at his chest, eyes wild. He spoke of ancient curses and forgotten horrors, stories that sent chills down their spines. But his words made no sense, at least not at first. Each time someone tried to calm him down, his ramblings grew louder and more frantic. It was clear that something inside him had snapped, and the terror had dug its claws into him, just as it had into the rest of them. Zara and Dorian, once close siblings, found themselves at odds. Fear turned to suspicion, and suspicion turned to anger. "You did this, didn't you?" Zara hissed, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. "You're the one who brought it here." She pointed at the doll, now sitting eerily still, its grin never fading. Dorian's face reddened with rage. "I didn't bring it here. You think I want this to happen?" His voice cracked with the pressure of the growing fear, and he began pacing back and forth, clearly on edge. With every passing moment, the house itself seemed to change. The walls seemed to stretch and warp, growing darker and more oppressive. The ceiling appeared lower, as if the space was becoming tighter, trapping them inside. The once warm and inviting home felt like a tomb, and each step they took seemed to echo, louder than before, filling the house with a suffocating silence. Cleo, the family dog, was no longer the playful, carefree animal he knew. She refused to go anywhere near the doll. She backed away from it, growling low in her throat, her fur standing on end. When anyone tried to approach the doll, Cleo would bark and snarl, as though warning them away from the cursed object. It was as if the dog knew something they didn't, sensing the dark force that surrounded the doll. But no one could protect them from it, not even Cleo. The family's unity, once their strength, began to crumble under the weight of fear. Each argument, each outburst, pushed them further apart. The bonds that had once held them together started to disintegrate, replaced by suspicion and dread. It was clear now that the curse had already begun its work, twisting their thoughts, turning them against each other. No one could trust anyone anymore. Every word spoken seemed to carry a hidden meaning, every glance exchanged filled with accusation. Celine tried to hold it together, but even her strong resolve was faltering. Her hands trembled as she reached for the phone to call for help, but the signal was gone. The lines were dead. There was no escape, no way to call for assistance. The house had trapped them, just as the doll had trapped them in its dark, twisted grip. The air in the house grew thick with unease, the shadows stretching out like long fingers, reaching for them. With every passing minute, the tension grew more unbearable. The family members stood in the living room, eyes darting nervously, every noise amplified in the oppressive silence. The doll sat in its corner, its eyes gleaming with malice, its smile stretching wider, as if it was enjoying the chaos unfolding before it. The question lingered in the air. Who or what was causing all of this? Was it the doll, its curse taking hold of them one by one? Or was something far darker at play, something tied to the house itself? The feeling of being watched, of being hunted, grew stronger. The house wasn't just alive. It was feeding off their fear. The doll was just the vessel, the doorway to something far worse. Aurelia, shaking with fear, whispered, "We need to leave. Now." Her voice cracked, barely audible over the pounding of her heart. But no one moved. No one could move. They were trapped, paralyzed by the terror that was closing in around them. The house was no longer a home. It was a prison, and they were its unwilling captives. The night stretched on, each minute more torturous than the last. The family, divided by fear, stood together in that single room, hearts racing, minds unraveling. The doll had already won, and they were only beginning to realize how much more it had planned for them. The family, their nerves frayed and hearts heavy with terror, finally decided to act. Desperation had overtaken reason. They gathered around the doll, the very source of their torment, hands trembling as they reached for a forgotten ritual. It was a last-ditch effort, a feeble attempt to rid themselves of the evil that had taken over their home. Celine, Callum, Zara, Dorian, and Granville stood together, their eyes wild with fear as they recited the strange words from an old book they had found in the attic. The words felt wrong on their tongues, foreign and ancient, but they had no choice. If they didn't act now, they knew the terror would consume them all. The moment the words left their lips, the room went silent. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, with a deep, rumbling groan, the house seemed to come alive. The walls shook violently, sending tremors through the floor, rattling the windows with deafening force. The light bulbs overhead flickered, threatening to burn out. The temperature in the room dropped so quickly that the family's breath became visible, swirling in the icy air. They could feel the chill in their bones, a coldness that wasn't just in the air, but seemed to penetrate everything, even their very souls. The doll's eyes, once empty and lifeless, now glowed with an unnatural, malevolent light. A sickly green hue radiated from its sockets, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The smile on its cracked porcelain face widened, stretching impossibly far, as if mocking them for thinking they could control what was happening. A low, guttural laugh seemed to echo from nowhere, filling the room with an overwhelming sense of dread. It was as if the doll was not just an object, but a conduit for something far darker. Celine's heart raced as the realization hit her like a physical blow. The ritual had not banished the evil, it had only awakened it. The curse that had been bound to the doll was not just connected to the toy itself. It was tied to the very house they stood in. This house, once a home, was now a prison, and they had just unleashed something far worse than the doll. The walls cracked louder, the sound like bones breaking, and a terrible, unearthly screech filled the air. Shadows twisted and writhed in the corners of the room, stretching like fingers reaching out from the depths of hell. The temperature continued to drop, and their breath came out in visible clouds. Something was stirring in the darkness, something far worse than they had ever imagined. It wasn't the doll that was the true terror, it was what the doll had been hiding. A shape began to materialize in the corner of the room. At first, it was just a flicker, a shadow moving too quickly to make sense of. But then, slowly, it took form. A figure, tall and twisted, cloaked in darkness, emerged from the shadows. Its eyes were like burning coals, its face twisted in a grotesque mockery of humanity. The figure seemed to float, its feet never touching the ground, as it drifted toward them with unnerving speed. It was the spirit that had been trapped here for generations, its anger and hatred festering for years, just waiting to be set free. The family stood frozen, their bodies trembling with fear as the spirit loomed before them, its voice a low, growling whisper. "You should have left it alone," it hissed, its voice like nails scraping across metal. "Now you will pay the price." Aurelia screamed as the air in the room grew thick with malevolent energy. The shadows closed in around them, the house itself seeming to press in from all sides. The spirit was no longer just a shadow, it was real, and it was angry. It had been waiting for this moment, and now it had them. They had unleashed something they couldn't control, something far older and more powerful than anything they had imagined. The very foundation of the house seemed to tremble beneath their feet, as if it were alive, shifting, reacting to the spirit's power. The family tried to move, tried to run, but it was as if the house itself was holding them in place, trapping them in its dark embrace. The spirit moved closer, its presence suffocating, its every step sending a ripple of terror through the air. Granville, his eyes wide with fear, reached out a trembling hand to the doll, which was still sitting in its corner, now glowing brighter than ever. It's too late," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of the house groaning in agony. The doll had always been the key. The house, the curse, the spirit, it had all been tied together. They were not just dealing with a haunted object. They were trapped in a place that had been cursed long before they arrived. The evil had been waiting, lying dormant for years, and now that it had been awakened, there was no escape. The spirit's cold, hollow laugh echoed in their ears, drowning out their screams. It had them now. The ritual had only sealed their fate. They had tried to fight, to escape, but in the end, they were just another family caught in the grip of something far older and darker than they could ever understand. And as the shadows closed in around them, the last thing they saw was the doll's eyes, still glowing with that unholy light, staring back at them with malevolent glee. There was no way out. They had unleashed the evil, and now it would claim them all. As the clock struck midnight, a cold, suffocating silence fell over the house. The family stood frozen, terror gripping their hearts. The walls creaked and groaned, the house now a crumbling shell that seemed to threaten to collapse at any moment. The air was thick with dread, and the malevolent spirit hovered before them, its eyes burning like fiery coals, a twisted, horrifying smile etched across its face. It was no longer a shadow or an unseen presence. It was fully real, standing before them, its form shifting, undulating, as if it were made of the very darkness that filled the room. "You are running out of time," the spirit whispered, its voice like the scraping of nails on a chalkboard, chilling and unnatural. "The price must be paid. One of you must sacrifice themselves to break the curse. If you do not, all of you will suffer." The family's eyes darted around the room, frantic, searching for any sign of hope. But the house was against them now. The floors seemed to buckle beneath their feet, and every flicker of light cast twisted shadows on the walls. The once cozy home, filled with laughter and warmth just hours ago, had become a nightmare, a dark and hostile prison. The doll, still glowing in the corner, seemed to mock them with its cold, lifeless smile. Granville, his face pale and wrinkled with fear, trembled as he turned to Selim and Callum. We can't all survive this. One of us has to give in." His voice was shaky, but there was a desperate, pleading look in his eyes. "The spirit wants a soul. We have to give it to the darkness. It's the only way." Zara, her voice rising in panic, shook her head. "No, we can't let anyone die. We're a family." Her eyes were wide, filled with terror, but also with determination. She couldn't accept that any of them would be sacrificed, not even to save the others. But Dorian, the youngest of the siblings, looked at the others with a hollow expression, his face drained of color. "We have no choice. We've seen what this thing is capable of. It'll destroy us all if we don't act. Someone has to make the sacrifice." His voice was calm, almost eerily so, as though he had already made his decision. Aurelia clutched Kai to her chest, her heart racing. "I won't let anyone die," she cried, the tears streaming down her face. "There has to be another way." But the spirit only laughed, a sound that sent chills through the room. "There is no other way, little girl. The curse must be fed. It is the only way for you to live." The walls continued to shake, dust falling from the ceiling, and a terrible, suffocating darkness pressed in from every side. The house was collapsing in on them, and with each passing second, the family felt as though the very air around them was growing heavier, more suffocating. The doll's eyes burned brighter, its smile ever widening, as if it were enjoying their misery. Selim, Callum, Zara, and Dorian exchanged fearful glances, each of them struggling with the impossible choice that lay before them. Their hearts pounded in their chests, and time seemed to slow as the weight of the decision crushed down on them. The spirit's form grew larger, its shadow stretching across the walls, its hands like long, twisted claws. "Choose now," it hissed, its voice rising into a deafening roar. "The clock is ticking." And then, as if the house itself was drawing its final breath, the family realized they had no choice but to make the sacrifice. Someone had to step forward to break the curse, to end the nightmare that had torn their family apart. Granville, the oldest, stepped forward with a look of quiet resolution in his eyes. "It has to be me," he said, his voice soft but firm. "I've lived my life. It's my time." His words were final, and before anyone could protest, he turned to face the spirit. The dark figure reached out with its long, skeletal hand, its fingers wrapping around Granville's arm like a vice. The spirit's laughter filled the room, louder than before, as it began to drag him toward the shadows. "No!" Celine screamed, but it was too late. The house seemed to tremble as Granville was pulled into the darkness. His body disappeared into the shadowy void, and the room fell silent. The family stood, frozen in horror, their eyes wide in disbelief. The house seemed to exhale, the walls creaking as if releasing a long-held breath. The temperature returned to normal, and the light flickered once before stabilizing. But as the silence lingered, the family's relief was short-lived. The terror had not ended, it had only changed form. The spirit, now fading, turned to them one last time, its eyes still glowing with a sinister light. "You think this is over?" it asked, its voice a low, mocking whisper. "The curse is broken, but not for long. You have one night. The nightmare will return. It always does." With that, the spirit disappeared into the shadows, leaving the family alone in the ruined house. But the damage had been done. The curse had been broken, but at what cost? In the eerie silence that followed, the family stood together, trembling in the dark. They had survived. But for how long? Was the nightmare truly over, or was it just beginning again? The clock on the wall ticked on, the seconds passing. But in that moment, nothing felt real. The family had made their choice, but they couldn't shake the feeling that something far worse was yet to come. The house, now eerily quiet, seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next chapter to begin.